some chapbooks that I'd like to sell for those of you who happen to like the work. They're usually $6 or $5 today because we never have change. And there are also some collections of poems of the Sarasota poets that we gave on a tour of the Southwest, which maybe Joan could get out of the suitcase and hold up and show to people, which has some of Ray's poetry, my poetry, and Joan's, as well as some poetry of Sylvia Corbello. They're also going for $5. It's about the size of a chapbook, but much bigger. And as you'll see, it has Sarasota poets on it. And we'll put a couple up for sale, Joan, if you can take them out. And if you don't like, it has a little history about the Sarasota poets inside. And if you don't like the poetry, of course, you could always put your own in there and pretend that they're Sarasota poets or Bradenton poets. So we'll have, these are also $5. They're nice. But Sylvia Corbello, by the way, is an NEA fellow. She's going to be reading with us also at the Cafe New Yorican with a poet named Dionisio Martinez, who just won 2 big prizes. He has 2 books being published simultaneously, both Cuban Americans. And I think it's well worth taking a look at her work. 4 or 5 of her poems are in this as well, or in the bulk of them. Do you have any more there, Joan, we could just put up? This is the only one we have. We only have a few left from the tour. And Sheldon Friedman, who is helping us put this together, this is a monstrous task trying to tape this. We'll take your $5 and give you change, but we'll do that after the performance is over. One of the things we'd like to do now is to go into something that's going to be a little unusual. Joan's going to read a short poem, and then we're going to go into 2 relatively, I would say, unusual poems. Some will be long. One thing I would ask you to do is think of our poems as music. Think of like you're listening to Bruce Springsteen or somebody. You don't have to listen to every word. I hate to see people scrunching down looking for the participles. Just let it go. In fact, our poetry is such that it's developed that it's meant to be like speech. You should hear it like speech. You should forget some of it like speech. And some of it should make your hair stand up, like great speech. We would both like to approach you as people on the street who tell you something. At the end of that conversation, your hair will stand up in the back of your head and you'll be moved someday. We don't want you to listen to every word. We want you to feel the soul that's coming out of the poems. Anyway, Joan is going to do one to start off with, and I'll let her introduce it.
Well, you don't have to listen to every word of Justin's poems, but definitely because they're short. You have a really short attention span. This poem is for all you people who do a little yoga and know a little yoga. It's called Inverted Pose. I tried to stand on my head today, but couldn't. I'd lost that balance point I'd never had to think about before, like forgetting how to ride a bicycle or breathe. I told myself to stop wanting to be kissed, which just made it worse. And all day, endless images of our tongues diving into each other's mouths, and don't even ask about the nights. Where's that part about love being wonderful? The transcendent part? So far, there's just this walking into walls.
We're going to do I'm going to do a rather long Yaqui poem. I'm the inventor of Yaqui poetry, I think. That's not spelled Y-A-Q-U-I, as in the Don Juan books, but Y-A-K-K-Y. It just goes on and on. It's a rap. It's like white rap that I grew up with as a kid in New York. We were rapping then, too. And it's just stayed with me. It's a poem about an awakening in childhood, about 11 or 12. It's set in New York, where I grew up. The poem is called Mrs. Taliaferro, and it's read by myself and Joan as 12-year-olds. And to accomplish this, we sit on little boxes like the little kids. This is our new stage props. We'll see how they go with you folks. Anyway, this is Mrs. Taliaferro.
Go back as far as you can.
Okay. And close.
His hips are even bigger than mine.
She's always kidding me about my big hips, but I told her that Muhammad Ali had big hips too. Anyway, we know what happened to him. He's brain dead now. Anyway. I want you to sit back, and this is going to go on for some time. Just think of it as a very long Perry Mason show you're watching. It's what it usually shows. It's what my wife watches anyway, when she comes home from work. Mrs. Taliaferro.
Listen to me. My father's name is Taliaferro. He's the Italian, not my mother. My mother's Bolivian.
Anthony said when I asked him why his mother was always speaking Spanish and something that sounded like animals clicking their teeth together. And I guess it also explained her cheekbones and why she was so tiny, because she had these little bones like a sparrow. She's even smaller than Anthony, who was only 11 and kind of small himself. I liked Anthony. He had that direct, matter-of-fact way of explaining things that most European kids seem to have. So when I asked him what I wanted to know, and my mother too, by the way, which was, where is Mr. Taliaferro? And why does your mother walk around the apartment all day in her slip? He looked at me with his mother's dark, wide-open eyes.
My father is in Argentina. He sends us money.
And when he saw I was still waiting.
My mother doesn't like clothes. She likes slips.
Which pretty much settled things for me, but not my mother. Because when I told her about Anthony's father, she looked up at the ceiling and said,
well, wouldn't you know, another Italian. And this time he's in Argentina.
Which was pretty much my mother's standard response to men. But she didn't say anything about Mrs. Taliaferro's preference for slips. Just looked at me like she sent the wrong messenger on the errand. But there was still talk at the table about the men visiting her apartment during the day. But after a few weeks, even my father got tired of it and said, Margaret, give it a rest, will you? Which pretty much ended it, except my mother would ask me every so often what I did at Anthony's, and I'd say, oh, nothing, just listen to her sing. Because Mrs. Taliaferro sang all the time. Mostly operas she'd learned from Anthony's father, according to Anthony, but all we listened to were Bing Crosby and Perry Como, and sometimes Joe Stafford. But after a while,
I liked listening to Mrs. Taliaferro. She'd sing all these beautiful operas by Puccini, and sometimes she'd even sing an entire aria, except when she sang the male parts, she sometimes sounded like dogs growling, and she'd crack up, start laughing in this wild high cackle, and I guess if we'd be living anywhere else, she would have been evicted.
But this was for Tryon, on the Upper West Side near the cloisters, and most of the tenants were Jews, lucky enough to have escaped the fatherland, but they must have brought a bit of it with them. Because every weekend I'd sit in my window watching them walk up and down the Esplanade overlooking the Hudson like it was the Lindenstrasse. And they'd have these dark coats on and hats, all the time hats, and if they weren't walking, they'd be standing around in little bunches or sitting on benches, jabbing at each other with their fingers or throwing their hands up in the air like they were surrendering. But they never complained about Mrs. Taliaferro because she sang Mozart's operas too. Not a lot. Like I say, she preferred Puccini, but she did enough to make the neighbors forget about the men visitors and her walking around in her slip all day, because these people were crazy for Mozart. They had Mozart for breakfast and for lunch and for dinner. And don't forget about the snacks, the little schnitzels. I mean, if Mozart had walked down the Esplanade one weekend, hundreds of middle-aged women would have torn off their corsets, men dropped their pants. That's how crazy they were about Mozart. So whenever she sang Magic Flute, they'd be sitting in their windows listening to her, and there'd be these endless discussions the next day in the courtyard about her. Our Eva Zumack, they'd be nodding to each other, because I guess they thought she had a chorus in her apartment, and backdrops and costumes, just like at Carnegie Hall. So I tell them the apartment was almost empty, that Mrs. Taliaferro would wander around it all day like she was following animal tracks, or sometimes
she'd stare out the window for hours, or turn on 4 or 5 radios all at once, which should have sounded like gibberish, but it didn't. It sounded like a forest full of birds, don't ask me how. Or sometimes she'd go to the refrigerator and pull out a bottle of Rheingold beer and turn to me with this big grin on her face, screaming, Rheingold! Rheingold! Like it was the biggest joke in the world. And then she'd climb into one of the hammocks strung around the apartment and start swinging back and forth, humming to herself. But I never told my mother about all that, because she would have ended it right there. And I liked the hammocks and the beer too, because sometimes Mrs. Taliaferro would give us one and we'd all be swinging in the hammock screaming,
Rheingold! Rheingold! Because Mrs. Taliaferro didn't really do anything except sing. She didn't even cook. Anthony did that. And the shopping and the cleaning too. All she did was lie around in the hammocks or stare out the windows with all the radios playing. But things changed after dinner because she'd grab a bottle of beer and climb up into her favorite hammock, a big woven red and green one overlooking our apartment, and she'd start making noises like birds and cats and dogs, these little imitations, and the dog in the next apartment would go crazy. And after that she'd tell us these scary stories, and we'll all be sitting around on the floor looking up at her, and sometimes she told them in that tongue that sounded like animals clicking their teeth together, except Anthony was the only one who really understood it. Even his two younger brothers didn't. Don't ask me why. They were twins, about 5 years old, and they looked like real little fat bambinos. Not at all like Anthony and his mother, but they liked the stories because they were all pretty much the same. They were about a mother or an aunt and 3 children who had been abandoned in the woods or the city or an airport. And sometimes the kids would be boys and sometimes girls, but nobody seemed to care. And sometimes she'd even throw in a 4th character, just for me, usually a cousin. But the stories were dark and sad, and the animal sounds scared me. And I'd want to go home because she'd be drinking, and her eyes would be all dark and round and glittery. But sooner or later she'd start singing Puccini, and things would begin to settle down. And sometimes
she'd sing the aria from Butterfly, where Cho-Cho-san is waiting for Pinkerton to return, and she's looking out the window at the ships, and this long, high blossom is rising from her throat like she's bleeding to death, and everyone except her knows some lackey is coming ashore to tell her Pinkerton's married to some white bread back home. Well, anyway, she'd sing that particular aria. Un bel dia is the one, I think. And then she'd go back and sing it again, but when she did, she'd improvise, always keeping the melody, but weaving in these moans and cries until the aria was bleeding so much I wanted to cry. And I'd get up and go downstairs to bed and try to forget it. But it was always there, rising and falling through my window. That's what my nights were like, whenever she sang Butterfly. So whether I was reading comic books or eating dinner or doing my homework, the music was always tumbling down out of her apartment until it seemed like I was living next to an orange grove that never stopped blossoming. That's how sweet and sad it was.
And I remember lying in my bed late one summer night, and she was singing Butterfly again. Who knows why, except as I was leaving her apartment, she told me she was going to sing it for me, that she knew I liked it. So I said, okay. But I didn't mean it because her eyes were slippery and dark, and I didn't want to hear Butterfly. It made me cry. And besides, I wanted to try what my cousin Timmy had shown me the day before. He was grinning and telling me it was fun. He just pulled it up and down, and he had his dick out and he was rubbing it up and down in his hand, and he looked so happy and greedy, I wanted to turn away. And then I felt something click inside me. So quietly I almost didn't hear it, but I knew as soon as I was alone, I was going to try it. And I remember lying there that night, and it's hot, and the window's wide open, and I can hear her voice tumbling down out of her apartment, and I'm lying naked on top of the sheets, and there's this white moonlight filling up the room, and my cock is growing warmer and thicker. I haven't even touched myself yet, and then I'm moving my hand up and down like it's alive, and I'm rising out of my body. I don't know where I am, and then I'm standing in front of the window, holding the warm glitter spilling from my belly, looking up at Mrs. Taliaferro's apartment, her beautiful, irreparably lost voice dragging like a razor down my body. Thank you.